There is something unsettling about the way peace exists in the world of shinobi, because it is never truly peace at all, but rather a quiet pause between tragedies, a fragile stillness that only feels calm until you begin to notice what it was built upon. And once you do, it becomes impossible to ignore the weight beneath it, the lives that were quietly erased, the choices that were made in shadows, and the strange, almost uncomfortable truth that many of the most important moments in this world were not moments of heroism, but moments where everything went wrong in ways that could never be undone. If you were to stand in the Hidden Leaf Village during one of its calmer days, when the streets are filled with ordinary movement and the air carries a sense of safety, you might never guess that this same place was once shaped by decisions so dark that they would fracture entire bloodlines. Decisions that were made not out of cruelty alone, but out of fear, calculation, and a belief that sacrificing a few could somehow protect the many, even if that belief left scars that would never fully heal. And perhaps that is where the unease truly begins, because the darkest moments in this world are not always driven by villains who act without reason, but by people who believed they were doing what had to be done. People who stood at the edge of impossible choices and stepped forward anyway, leaving behind consequences that would echo long after they were gone, shaping futures in ways they could never fully control. There is a quiet pattern to these moments, one that repeats itself across generations, where conflict is never truly resolved, but simply passed forward, reshaped into new forms, carried by those who inherit not only the will of their predecessors, but also their mistakes. And it is in this pattern that you begin to understand something deeply unsettling, that darkness in this world is not an exception, but a foundation. Long before Naruto Uzumaki ever walked through the gates of the village, before he carried within him the burden that would define his existence, there was another time, one that feels distant and almost forgotten, where the world was even more fractured, even more unstable, and where survival itself often meant becoming something you might not recognize if you were forced to look too closely. The era of constant war was not simply a backdrop to history, but a defining force that shaped every decision, every alliance, and every betrayal. And within that era, children were not protected from conflict, but placed directly within it, raised with the understanding that their lives could end at any moment, and that the only way to ensure even a chance at survival was to become stronger than those who stood against them. It is difficult to fully grasp what that kind of world does to a person, especially to someone who has never known anything else, because when violence becomes routine, when loss becomes expected, something begins to change in the way people see one another. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the line between enemy and human being starts to blur until it nearly disappears. One of the earliest and most quietly devastating examples of this can be found in the lives of two young boys who would one day become legends, but who at that time were simply children trying to survive in a world that offered them very little room for anything else. And what makes their story so heavy is not just what they would become, but what they were forced to endure before they ever had the chance to choose a different path. Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha were born into opposing clans during a time when those clans existed in a near constant state of conflict, where alliances were temporary and trust was almost non-existent. And from the moment they were old enough to understand the world around them, they were taught that the other side was not simply an enemy, but something that had to be eliminated. And yet, in a quiet and almost fragile moment, far removed from the expectations placed upon them, they met not as enemies, but as children. And for a brief period of time, something unusual began to form between them. A connection that existed outside of the hatred that defined their clans. Something that felt almost impossible in a world like theirs. They spoke of dreams that seemed distant and unrealistic. Dreams of a place where children would not have to fight, where the cycle of death that surrounded them could somehow be broken. And in those moments, it must have felt as though such a future might actually be within reach, as though the world could be reshaped if only enough people believed in it. But the world they lived in was not one that allowed such dreams to exist without consequence, and the truth of who they were, of where they came from, eventually surfaced in a way that could not be ignored, forcing them to confront the reality that the bond they had formed was built on something that could not survive within the structure of their world. There is a quiet cruelty in that realization, because it is not a moment of sudden violence or dramatic betrayal, but a slow and inevitable collapse of something that might have changed everything if it had been allowed to grow. And instead, it becomes just another piece of the larger pattern, another example of how the world resists change, even when it is presented with the possibility of something better. As time moves forward, that brief connection does not disappear entirely, but it becomes buried beneath layers of expectation, duty, and loss. And what replaces it is something far heavier. A rivalry shaped not only by personal conflict, but by the weight of everything they were forced to inherit. Their story is often remembered for what it ultimately becomes, for the battles that would define an era. But there is something much darker in its beginning, in the quiet understanding that the path they were set on was never truly their own, that from the moment they were born, they were placed into a system that demanded conflict, and that even their attempts to resist it would eventually be pulled back into its orbit. And this is where the darkness begins to deepen, because the founding of the Hidden Leaf Village, which is often seen as a moment of hope, a turning point where the chaos of constant war was finally brought under control, is not as simple as it appears. And when you look closely, you begin to notice the contradictions that exist within it. The village was meant to be a solution, a way to bring clans together under a single structure, to create stability where there had once been only conflict. But in doing so, it did not erase the tensions that existed between those clans. It merely contained them, compressing years of resentment, fear, and mistrust into a single space where they would continue to exist, quietly shaping the future in ways that would not become fully visible until much later. For someone like Madara, who had experienced loss in a way that was deeply personal and deeply unresolved, this new structure did not represent peace in the way it did for others, but rather a temporary arrangement that could collapse at any moment. And the more he looked at it, the more he began to see not a solution, but a delay. It is easy to view his eventual descent as something inevitable, as the actions of someone who chose darkness. But when you trace it back to its origin, it becomes something far more complicated, because it is rooted in a perspective that was shaped by a lifetime of conflict, a belief that the world could not be trusted to remain stable, that peace, as it was presented, was an illusion. And perhaps what makes this so unsettling is not whether he was right or wrong, but the fact that his perspective is understandable, that when you place yourself within that world, within that history, it becomes difficult to dismiss his fears entirely, because the pattern of conflict had repeated itself for so long that expecting it to suddenly stop might seem almost naive. As the village grows, as leadership is established and systems are put into place, there is a sense of progress, of movement toward something better. But beneath that progress, the same underlying tensions remain. And over time, they begin to surface in subtle ways, in decisions that favor one group over another, in mistrust that is never fully addressed, in quiet divisions that are allowed to persist. These are not moments that draw immediate attention, not events that are remembered as major turning points, but they are just as important because they lay the groundwork for what is to come, creating conditions where larger, more visible tragedies can take place. And it is within this slow accumulation of unresolved conflict that the darkness continues to build, almost unnoticed at first, like a shadow that gradually expands until it becomes impossible to ignore. And by the time it does, the world has already been shaped by it in ways that cannot be easily reversed. What makes these early moments so significant is not just what happens within them, but what they represent, the beginning of a pattern that will repeat itself again and again, where attempts to create peace are undermined by the very systems meant to sustain it, where individuals are forced into roles that demand sacrifice without guarantee, and where the line between protection and control becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish. And as this pattern takes hold, as it begins to define the structure of the shinobi world, it sets the stage for events that will be far more visible, far more devastating. Moments where the consequences of these early decisions will finally come to the surface in ways that can no longer be contained, revealing just how fragile the idea of peace truly is when it is built upon a foundation that has never fully healed. There is a quiet inevitability to it, a sense that once certain paths are taken, they cannot be undone, and that even the best intentions can lead to outcomes that are far darker than anyone could have anticipated. And it is within that inevitability that the story begins to shift, moving from the subtle, almost hidden darkness of its beginnings into something far more direct, far more difficult to ignore, where the cost of these choices becomes impossible to overlook, even for those who once believed they were necessary. There is something almost deceptive about the idea of a new beginning. Because when the Hidden Leaf Village was first established, it carried with it a quiet promise that the world could finally change, that the endless cycle of war that had defined generations might slowly begin to fade. And for a time, it truly seemed as though that promise might hold, as though the fragile peace that had been created could grow into something lasting, something real. But peace, when it is built on unhealed wounds, does not settle cleanly. And beneath the surface of cooperation, something far more unstable continued to exist, something that could not simply be erased by gathering former enemies under the same name. Because while the structure of the world had changed, the people within it had not, and the memories they carried, the losses they had endured, remained as present as ever. Nowhere was this more quietly visible than in the relationship between those who had once stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, particularly within the Uchiha Clan, who, despite being instrumental in the founding of the village, found themselves gradually shifting into a position that felt less like inclusion and more like distance, a subtle but undeniable separation that grew over time in ways that were never fully acknowledged, but always deeply felt. Tobirama Senju, who would eventually become the second Hokage, approached the idea of peace not with the same hopeful idealism as his brother, but with a more calculated and cautious perspective, one shaped by his own experiences in war and his understanding of how fragile stability could be if left unchecked. And while his intentions were rooted in protecting the village, the methods he chose would leave behind consequences that extended far beyond his lifetime. His decision to place the Uchiha in charge of the military police may have seemed, on the surface, like a position of trust and authority. But in practice, it created a separation that was difficult to ignore, placing them slightly outside the core of the village's power structure, giving them responsibility without true influence. And over time, this distinction began to shape the way they were perceived, not as equal members of the village, but as something slightly apart from it. It is in these kinds of decisions, quiet and administrative, that some of the darkest moments truly begin, because they do not announce themselves as tragedies. They do not immediately reveal their consequences, but instead, they settle into the foundation of the world, altering its structure in subtle ways until those alterations begin to surface in forms that are far more difficult to control. For the Uchiha, this slow shift created a growing sense of isolation, one that was not driven by a single event, but by a series of small, accumulating experiences, moments where trust felt conditional, where their loyalty seemed to be questioned not openly, but implicitly. And over time, this tension began to harden into something more defined, something that would eventually take shape in ways no one could ignore. At the same time, the village itself continued to expand, to strengthen, to present the appearance of unity and progress. And yet, even as it did, the world beyond its borders remained unstable, and conflict, though less constant than before, never truly disappeared, instead returning in waves that would test the very systems that had been created to prevent it. The first great ninja war was one such moment, a reminder that even with the establishment of hidden villages, the desire for power, for control, for survival, still drove nations into conflict. And within that war, a new generation of shinobi would come to understand the same harsh realities that had shaped those before them. It is easy to think of war in terms of large battles and strategic movements, but the true weight of it is often found in much smaller moments, in the experiences of individuals who are forced into situations that demand far more from them than they should ever be expected to give. And in this war, there is one moment that stands quietly among the rest, one that does not rely on scale or spectacle, but on the quiet finality of a decision. Tobirama Senju, facing an impossible situation during a mission that had turned against him, chose to stay behind, to act as a decoy so that his students could escape. And while this act is often remembered as one of sacrifice and leadership, there is something darker within it when viewed more closely, something that reflects the reality of the world he helped shape. Because this was not simply a heroic decision made in isolation, but a moment that revealed the underlying truth of the shinobi system, that survival often depends on someone choosing to remain behind, on someone accepting that they will not return. And while this choice may be framed as noble, it is also deeply tragic, because it is a necessity created by the very structure of the world itself. His students would go on to become some of the most influential figures in the village's history, carrying forward his teachings, shaping the future in ways that would impact generations. But they would also carry the memory of that moment, the understanding that the system they served demanded sacrifices that could not always be justified, even if they were necessary. And this is where the darkness begins to deepen once again. Because those who inherit the will of their predecessors do not only inherit their ideals, but also the unresolved consequences of their decisions. And as time moves forward, those consequences begin to manifest in new and often more complex ways. The next generation, raised in a world that was supposed to be more stable, more controlled, finds itself facing many of the same challenges, the same conflicts, the same underlying tensions that had never truly been resolved. And in their attempts to navigate this world, they are often forced into choices that mirror those that came before them. Among them are 3 individuals whose bond would become one of the most significant in the history of the village, not because it remained unbroken, but because of how it ultimately fractured, revealing just how fragile even the strongest connections can be when placed under the weight of the world they lived in. Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Orochimaru began as teammates, bound together by shared experiences, by the trials they faced during the Second Great Ninja War, and for a time, their connection seemed unshakable, something that could endure even the harshest conditions. But war does not leave people unchanged, and as they moved through it, each of them responded in different ways, shaped by their own perspectives, their own fears, and their own understanding of what it meant to survive in a world where loss was constant. Tsunade, burdened by the repeated deaths of those she cared for, began to see the futility in the system, the endless cycle of fighting and dying that never seemed to lead to anything lasting. And her eventual withdrawal from the village was not an act of abandonment, but a response to a grief that had become too heavy to carry. Jiraiya, in contrast, chose to remain connected, to search for meaning within the chaos, to believe that there was still a way to change the world, even if that belief required him to endure loss again and again. And in many ways, he became a bridge between what the world was and what it could be, holding on to hope even when it seemed increasingly distant. But it is Orochimaru's path that stands as one of the darkest reflections of the world they lived in, because while the others were shaped by loss, he was shaped by something deeper, a fear of death itself, a desire to escape the limitations that defined human existence. And in that desire, he began to move further and further away from the values that once connected him to his team. At first, this shift is subtle, almost unnoticeable, but over time, it becomes impossible to ignore, as his pursuit of knowledge leads him into areas that cross lines that should never be crossed. And eventually, he reaches a point where the person he once was is no longer visible beneath the choices he has made. There is something particularly unsettling about his transformation, because it does not happen all at once, but gradually, step by step, decision by decision, until he becomes something entirely separate from the world he once belonged to, something that reflects the darker possibilities that exist within the shinobi system when its boundaries are pushed too far. And when his actions are finally revealed, when the extent of what he has done can no longer be hidden, the response is swift and decisive. But even in that response, there is a quiet acknowledgement of something deeper, something that cannot be easily resolved, because removing him does not erase the conditions that led him down that path. This is what makes these moments so heavy, because they are not isolated incidents, not singular events that can be addressed and then forgotten, but part of a larger pattern that continues to repeat. Each new generation inheriting not only the progress that has been made, but also the flaws that remain embedded within the system. And as these flaws continue to shape the world, they begin to lead toward moments that are even more devastating. Events that will test the limits of what the village can endure, forcing it to confront the reality that the peace it has built may not be as stable as it once believed, and that the darkest moments are not behind it, but still waiting, just beyond the edge of what can currently be seen. There is a certain kind of silence that follows tragedy, one that does not feel peaceful, but hollow, as though something essential has been removed from the world, and nothing has yet taken its place. And it is within that silence that some of the darkest moments begin to settle, not as sudden shocks, but as lingering absences that quietly reshape everything around them, changing the way people think, the way they trust, and the way they understand what it means to be safe. It is often said that war ends when the fighting stops, but in the shinobi world, that has never quite been true, because even when the battles fade and the weapons are lowered, the consequences remain, carried within those who survived, passed down through memory, through fear, through decisions that are made long after the original conflict has already concluded. And it is in this space, between what has ended and what continues, that the darkness begins to deepen in ways that are not always immediately visible. By the time the Third Great Ninja War begins to take shape, the world has already learned how to present the illusion of stability, how to maintain the appearance of order, even as tension quietly builds beneath the surface. And for those who have grown up within the village, there is a sense that things are different now, that the chaos of the past has been brought under control, that systems exist to prevent the kind of destruction that once seemed unavoidable. But war does not announce itself in obvious ways, not at first. And when it returns, it does so gradually, through small escalations, through conflicts that seem contained until they are not. And before long, the same patterns begin to reemerge, pulling another generation into a reality they were never truly prepared to face. Among those drawn into this conflict are 3 young shinobi, whose lives will become deeply intertwined with one another, not only through friendship, but through a series of events that will quietly alter the course of the world itself, though at the time they could not have known how significant those moments would become. Kakashi Hatake, Obito Uchiha, and Rin Nohara begin as a team shaped by the expectations placed upon them, by the need to survive, to complete missions, to prove themselves within a system that often demands maturity, long before it is naturally developed. And within that system, they form a bond that feels genuine, something that exists beyond the structure they are a part of. There is something quietly fragile about that bond, not because it is weak, but because it exists within a world that does not easily allow such connections to remain unchanged. And from the beginning, there are subtle signs that the path ahead will not be a simple one. Small tensions, unspoken insecurities, and the quiet pressure of expectations that each of them carries in their own way. Kakashi, already shaped by loss at a young age, moves through the world with a sense of detachment, guided by rules that he believes must be followed at all costs, perhaps because those rules offer a form of stability in a world that has taken so much from him. While Obito, in contrast, holds on to a more idealistic view, a belief that people matter more than missions, that connection is more important than strict adherence to orders. Rin exists between them, not as a point of division, but as something that holds them together, a reminder of what they are still capable of feeling in a world that often discourages such vulnerability. And for a time, their differences do not break them apart, but instead create a balance, a dynamic that allows them to function as a team. But the world they inhabit does not remain still. And as the war intensifies, the situations they are placed in begin to push them beyond the boundaries of what they can comfortably handle, forcing them into decisions that will carry consequences far beyond the moment in which they are made. There is a particular mission, one that at first seems like many others, that quietly becomes the turning point, though at the time it does not present itself as such. And it is within this mission that the fragile balance between them begins to shift in ways that cannot be undone. When Rin is captured, the situation demands action. But the nature of that action becomes a point of conflict. as Kakashi, guided by the rules he has come to rely on, initially prioritizes the mission itself, believing that deviating from it would create even greater risk, while Obito cannot accept that approach, cannot reconcile the idea that abandoning a teammate could ever be justified, no matter the circumstances. This moment, though it may seem small in the context of a larger war, carries a weight that is difficult to fully grasp, because it represents a fundamental divide in how they see the world, in what they believe it means to be a shinobi. And as that divide becomes more pronounced, it sets into motion a series of events that will reshape each of their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. Obito's decision to act, to prioritize Rin over the mission, leads to a confrontation that results in his own apparent death, crushed beneath falling debris in a moment that feels both sudden and inevitable, as though the world itself had closed in around him, leaving no space for a different outcome. There is a quiet finality to that moment, not only because of the loss itself, but because of what it represents. The cost of choosing connection over duty in a system that often does not allow for such choices to exist without consequence. And for Kakashi, who survives, the impact of that moment is profound, reshaping the way he understands everything he once believed. But the tragedy does not end there, because the world of shinobi rarely allows a single loss to stand alone. And what follows is perhaps even more unsettling, because it reveals something deeper about the nature of the conflict they are a part of, something that extends beyond individual choices and into the structure of the world itself. Rin, who had been rescued, who should have been safe, becomes something else entirely, turned into a weapon without her consent, transformed into a vessel for destruction in a way that strips her of agency, reducing her existence to a tool within a larger conflict that does not consider her as an individual, but only as a means to an end. There is something deeply disturbing about this, not because it is unusual within the context of war, but because of how quietly it is accepted as part of the system, how such actions are not seen as anomalies, but as strategies, as necessary measures taken in pursuit of victory, regardless of the human cost involved. And when the moment arrives, when Rin understands what has been done to her, when she recognizes the role she has been forced into, she makes a choice that is both heartbreaking and impossible to fully reconcile, choosing to end her own life in a way that ensures she cannot be used as a weapon against the village she still cares about. She moves into Kakashi's attack, turning his own strength into the means of her death. And in doing so, she leaves behind a moment that is as quiet as it is devastating. A moment that does not rely on spectacle, but on the weight of what it represents, the complete collapse of everything that once held their team together. For Kakashi, this becomes a defining trauma, one that reshapes his understanding of the world in a way that is difficult to escape, leaving him with the knowledge that the system he once trusted not only failed to protect those closest to him, but actively placed them in situations where such outcomes became possible. And somewhere, hidden beneath layers of assumption and belief, there is another truth, one that is not immediately visible, but that continues to exist beneath the surface, waiting to emerge in time. A truth that suggests that Obito's story did not end in that moment of apparent loss, but instead continued in a way that would eventually bring him back into the world, not as the person he once was, but as something shaped by everything that followed. It is this continuation, this transformation, that carries one of the darkest implications of all, because it shows that even those who begin with the desire to protect, to connect, to create something better, can be reshaped by the world they inhabit into something entirely different. Something that reflects not only their own pain, but the cumulative weight of the system that produced it. And as these threads begin to converge, as the consequences of these moments begin to ripple outward, it becomes increasingly clear that the war is not simply a series of battles to be won or lost, but a process that alters the very nature of those who pass through it, leaving behind changes that cannot be easily undone, changes that will continue to influence the world long after the fighting has ceased, quietly guiding it toward moments that are even darker, even more difficult to reconcile, as the illusion of control begins to give way to something far more uncertain. There is a moment, after enough time has passed, when grief begins to change its shape, when it is no longer as sharp or immediate as it once was, but instead settles into something quieter, something more persistent. And in the shinobi world, this kind of grief rarely fades into acceptance, but instead transforms into something else entirely, something that begins to influence decisions, to guide actions, to reshape the way individuals understand the world around them. And it is within this slow transformation that some of the most dangerous paths begin to form, not out of sudden malice, but out of a gradual shift in what feels necessary. For those who survived the Third Great Ninja War, the end of conflict did not bring clarity, but rather a strange and uneasy stillness, one that felt less like resolution and more like a pause, as though the world itself was waiting for something else to emerge, something that had been set in motion long before the war had officially concluded. And for many, there was a growing awareness that the systems meant to protect them were not as stable as they had once believed. Within the Hidden Leaf village, this awareness did not present itself openly, but instead existed beneath the surface, in the way decisions were made, in the quiet caution that began to define leadership, and in the subtle shifts in how trust was extended and withheld, particularly toward those who had already been positioned at the edges of the village's structure. The Uchiha Clan, already carrying the weight of isolation that had developed over time, began to feel this shift more acutely, not through direct confrontation, but through a series of small, accumulating signals, moments where their presence felt monitored rather than welcomed, where their role within the village seemed defined not by inclusion, but by control. At the center of this growing tension stood Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, a leader who, in many ways, embodied the ideal of balance. Someone who sought to maintain peace not through force alone, but through understanding, through patience, and through a belief that the village could still function as a unified whole despite the fractures that had begun to form. But even for someone like Hiruzen, there were limits to what could be achieved through idealism. And as the pressure surrounding the Uchiha continued to grow, as suspicion quietly hardened into something more defined, he found himself navigating a situation that had no clear solution. One where every attempt to maintain peace seemed to create new forms of instability elsewhere. It is within this tension that another figure begins to emerge more prominently. Someone whose approach to the world is far less forgiving, far more direct, and whose influence, though often hidden, begins to shape the direction of the village in ways that are both subtle and profound. Danzo Shimura does not believe in the same kind of balance that Hiruzen strives for, nor does he place the same value on transparency or trust. And for him, the idea of protecting the village is not tied to maintaining harmony, but to ensuring control, to eliminating uncertainty before it has the chance to grow into something that cannot be managed. There is something deeply unsettling about this perspective, not because it is entirely unreasonable, but because of where it leads. Because when protection becomes synonymous with control, the boundaries of what is acceptable begin to shift, and actions that might once have been unthinkable slowly become justifiable, even necessary, within the framework of that belief. Under Danzo's influence, the concept of security begins to take on a different meaning, one that prioritizes prevention over understanding, one that views potential threats not as situations to be resolved, but as variables to be removed. And within this approach, the Uchiha are no longer simply a clan within the village, but a possibility, a risk that must be monitored, contained, and eventually addressed. At the same time, beyond the immediate concerns of the village, there are other forces at work, quieter and far more difficult to detect. Individuals who operate in the shadows, whose goals extend beyond any single nation, and whose influence begins to weave its way through events in ways that are not immediately visible, but are deeply significant. Among these forces is the figure who once existed as a child, crushed beneath the weight of war, someone who should have been lost to time, but who instead was pulled back into the world through means that defy the natural order, reshaped not only physically, but psychologically, into something far removed from what he once was. Obito Uchiha does not return as the idealistic boy who believed that connection could overcome conflict, but as someone who has witnessed the fragility of that belief, who has experienced loss in a way that feels absolute, and who has come to see the world not as something that can be changed through hope, but as something fundamentally broken. There is a quiet but profound shift in his perspective, one that is not driven by sudden anger, but by a slow and deliberate acceptance of a different kind of truth. The idea that the world itself is flawed beyond repair, that the pain it produces is not an exception, but a constant, and that the only way to escape that pain is not to change the world, but to replace it entirely. This belief does not emerge fully formed. but develops over time, influenced by those who recognize its potential, who guide it, shape it, and direct it toward a larger purpose, one that extends far beyond personal grief and into something that encompasses the entire structure of reality as it is understood. As these forces begin to align, as the internal tensions within the village continue to grow, and as external influences quietly move into position, the stage is set for a moment that will redefine everything. A moment that will not only alter the course of the village's history, but will also reveal just how fragile the idea of peace truly is when it is built upon layers of unresolved conflict and hidden intentions. Within the Uchiha Clan, the sense of isolation has begun to crystallize into something more active, more defined, as discussions of dissatisfaction shift into considerations of action, as the idea of remaining within a system that does not fully trust them becomes increasingly difficult to accept, and as the possibility of reclaiming their place within the village begins to take on a different form. It is important to understand that this shift does not occur in a vacuum, nor is it driven by a simple desire for power, but by a complex mixture of fear, pride, history, and the growing belief that their position within the village is no longer sustainable in its current form. And as these feelings intensify, they begin to move toward a decision that will carry consequences far beyond what they can anticipate. At the same time, the leadership of the village is becoming increasingly aware of these developments, though their responses are far from unified. As Hiruzen continues to seek a path that avoids unnecessary bloodshed, while Danzo moves toward a solution that prioritizes certainty over compromise, believing that the risk posed by the Uchiha cannot be allowed to develop any further. This divergence in approach creates a space where decisions can be made outside the bounds of consensus, where actions can be taken that do not reflect the will of the village as a whole, but rather the perspective of those who believe that the ends justify the means. And it is within this space that one of the darkest moments in the history of the shinobi world begins to take shape. It does not begin with violence, nor with open conflict, but with a quiet agreement, a decision made in secrecy, one that is framed as necessary, as unavoidable, and yet carries with it a weight that cannot be easily reconciled, because it involves the destruction of something that cannot be replaced, something that extends beyond strategy and into the realm of identity itself. At the center of this decision stands a single individual, someone who embodies the contradictions of the world he lives in more clearly than almost anyone else, someone who is both a product of the system and a victim of it, someone who is asked to carry out an act that will define him not only in the eyes of others, but within himself. Itachi Uchiha is placed in a position that cannot be described as a choice in the traditional sense, because while options are presented, none of them lead to an outcome that can be considered truly acceptable. And within that impossible space, he is forced to decide what kind of future he is willing to create, and what he is willing to sacrifice in order to achieve it. The weight of this moment is difficult to fully grasp, because it exists on multiple levels at once, as a strategic decision, as a personal tragedy, and as a reflection of the system that made it possible. And as it begins to unfold, it carries with it a quiet inevitability, a sense that once the path has been chosen, there is no turning back. There is no spectacle in the beginning, no immediate eruption of conflict, but rather a stillness, a silence that precedes something far more devastating. And within that silence, the reality of what is about to happen begins to settle, not only for those directly involved, but for the world itself, as it moves closer to a moment that will leave a mark so deep that it can never truly be erased. A moment that will redefine the meaning of sacrifice, loyalty, and the cost of peace in ways that will continue to echo long after the night has passed. There are moments in history that are remembered not for how they begin, but for how they linger, for the way they continue to exist long after they have already ended, shaping everything that comes after them in ways that are not always immediately visible. And the night that would come to define the fate of the Uchiha Clan is one of those moments, not because of its scale alone, but because of the silence in which it unfolds. A silence so complete that it almost feels as though the world itself chose not to witness it. It does not begin with chaos or resistance, but with stillness, with the ordinary rhythm of a village settling into rest, unaware that within its boundaries a decision has already been made, one that will not only erase an entire clan, but will alter the moral foundation of the village itself in a way that can never fully be acknowledged, because to acknowledge it would require confronting something that is far too difficult to accept. At the center of this moment stands Itachi Uchiha, not as a figure of power or dominance, but as someone moving through a reality that has already been decided, someone who understands the weight of what he is about to do in a way that no one else can fully share, because the burden he carries is not only the act itself, but the understanding of why it must happen, or at least why it has been framed as something that must happen. There is something deeply unsettling about the nature of this task, because it is not driven by personal hatred, nor by a desire for vengeance, but by a calculated attempt to prevent a larger conflict, a civil war that could tear the village apart from within. And yet, in attempting to prevent that outcome, the solution that is chosen becomes something that mirrors the very violence it seeks to avoid, creating a contradiction that cannot be easily resolved. As he moves through the clan compound, there is no sense of hesitation in his actions, not because he feels nothing, but because hesitation would not change the outcome. And in that absence of hesitation, there is something almost mechanical, a quiet acceptance of a role that has been assigned, one that he carries out with a precision that only deepens the weight of the moment. The darkness of this night does not come from the act of violence alone, but from the relationships that exist within it, from the understanding that those who are lost are not strangers, not distant enemies, but family, friends, people who once existed within the same space of belonging. And in that closeness, the act itself takes on a different kind of weight, one that is not defined by conflict, but by its absence. There are no grand battles here, no prolonged struggles, but rather a series of quiet endings, each one contributing to a larger silence that grows heavier with every passing moment, until it becomes almost suffocating. A silence that cannot be broken, only endured. And yet, even within this silence, there is one moment that stands apart, not because it changes the outcome, but because it reveals something essential about the nature of what is taking place, something that cannot be understood through the broader scope of the event alone. When Sasuke Uchiha returns home, he does not yet understand what he is stepping into. And in that brief space of unawareness, there is a kind of innocence that still exists, something that has not yet been altered by what is about to be revealed. And it is this innocence that makes what follows so difficult to fully comprehend. The encounter between them is not defined by the violence that has already occurred, but by what is left unsaid, by the space between what is known and what is hidden. And in that space, Itachi makes a decision that extends beyond the immediate act, one that will shape Sasuke's entire life moving forward. He allows him to live. At first, this may seem like an act of mercy, but it is far more complex than that, because in choosing to spare him, Itachi is not freeing Sasuke from the consequences of that night, but rather binding him to them, creating a future in which Sasuke will carry the weight of that moment, will seek to understand it, to challenge it, to eventually confront it in a way that keeps the memory of the clan alive, even as the clan itself has been erased. And within that decision, there is another layer, one that is not immediately visible, but that reflects the deeper intention behind everything that has occurred. Because Sasuke is not only being spared, but guided, pushed toward a path that will keep him alive, that will make him stronger, that will give him a purpose, even if that purpose is rooted in hatred. This is where the darkness becomes even more complicated, because the act itself is not only destructive, but also constructive in a way that feels deeply unnatural, shaping a future through the manipulation of pain, through the deliberate creation of a narrative that is not entirely true, but is necessary to maintain the fragile balance that has been established. When the night finally ends, it does not do so with resolution, but with absence, with a space where something once existed, now completely removed. And the village, when it becomes aware of what has happened, does not respond with open acknowledgement, but with containment, with a quiet acceptance of the explanation that is provided, one that simplifies the event into something that can be understood without requiring deeper examination. Danzo Shimura's influence remains largely hidden, his role obscured behind layers of secrecy, while Hiruzen Sarutobi is left to carry the burden of a decision that he did not fully control. A situation that reflects the limitations of his leadership in a world where not all actions can be guided by idealism alone. For the village, the immediate result is stability, the prevention of internal conflict, the preservation of the structure that has been built over time. But beneath that stability, there is a fracture that cannot be seen, a moral cost that does not disappear simply because it is not openly discussed. For Sasuke, the result is something far more personal, far more immediate, as he is left alone within the remnants of what was once his home, carrying a question that cannot be answered, a sense of loss that cannot be reconciled, and a growing determination that begins to shape his future in ways that are both inevitable and deeply tragic. And somewhere beyond the immediate aftermath, beyond the visible consequences, there are others who observe what has taken place, who understand its significance not only as an isolated event, but as a signal, as an indication of the kind of decisions that can be made within this world when the balance between protection and control begins to shift too far in one direction. Among them, Obito Uchiha watches, not as a passive observer, but as someone who recognizes the deeper meaning within what has occurred, someone who sees in this moment a confirmation of the belief that the world cannot be trusted to function as it is, that its structure is inherently flawed, and that the only way to truly escape its cycle is to create something entirely different. This is what makes this moment one of the darkest in the history of the shinobi world, not simply because of the lives that were lost, but because of what it represents, the point at which the system reveals its willingness to sacrifice its own in order to maintain itself, the point at which the line between protection and destruction becomes almost indistinguishable. And as time continues to move forward, as the immediate impact begins to settle into memory, the consequences of this night do not fade, but instead begin to spread, influencing decisions, shaping perspectives, and guiding the actions of those who were touched by it, directly or indirectly, creating a ripple effect that will extend far beyond what anyone involved could have anticipated. Because some moments do not end when they are over. They continue, quietly, within the choices that follow them, within the paths that are shaped by them, and within the realization that once certain lines have been crossed, the world that exists afterward is never quite the same as the one that came before, even if, on the surface, it appears unchanged. There is a certain kind of aftermath that does not reveal itself all at once, but instead unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though the world itself is adjusting to something it cannot fully process. And in the wake of the night that erased the Uchiha Clan, that kind of aftermath begins to settle over the Hidden Leaf village in a way that feels deceptively calm, as though the absence left behind has been quietly absorbed into the structure of daily life, even while its consequences continue to spread beneath the surface. From a distance, the village appears unchanged, its systems intact, its leadership stable, its people continuing with their routines as though nothing fundamental has shifted. And yet, within that appearance of normalcy, there is a subtle but undeniable difference, a quiet tension that lingers in the spaces where something once existed, a sense that the foundation itself has been altered in a way that cannot be easily seen, but can always be felt. For those who are aware of what truly happened, who understand that the explanation presented to the public is incomplete, this tension carries a weight that is difficult to ignore, because it is not simply the memory of an event, but the knowledge of what it represents, the realization that the system they rely on is capable of actions that extend far beyond what is openly acknowledged. Actions that blur the line between protection and control in ways that cannot be easily justified, even when they are framed as necessary. At the center of this quiet shift stands Sasuke Uchiha, not as a participant in what occurred, but as its sole survivor within the village, someone who carries the entire weight of that night within himself, even if he does not yet fully understand it. And there is something deeply isolating about that position, something that separates him not only from others, but from the version of himself that existed before everything changed. His world does not collapse all at once, but rather fragments, piece by piece, as the reality of what has been lost begins to settle into his awareness. And within that fragmentation, there is a quiet transformation taking place, one that is not immediately visible, but that will gradually reshape everything about him, from the way he sees the world to the way he defines his own purpose within it. What remains most striking is not just the loss itself, but the way it is framed for him, the narrative that is presented, one that simplifies the complexity of what occurred into something more direct, more personal, and in doing so, guides him toward a path that feels both inevitable and deeply tragic, because it is built on a truth that has been deliberately distorted. He is given an enemy. Itachi Uchiha becomes not just the one who carried out the act, but the embodiment of it, the focal point through which all of Sasuke's pain can be directed. And within that framing, there is a kind of clarity that might not have existed otherwise, a purpose that emerges from the absence left behind, even if that purpose is rooted in something that cannot truly resolve what has been lost. This is where the darkness deepens in a way that is less visible, but no less significant, because the consequences of that night are no longer confined to what has already happened, but begin to extend forward, shaping the future through the manipulation of memory, through the careful construction of a narrative that will influence the decisions of those who carry it. For Sasuke, this manifests as a singular focus, a quiet but unyielding determination that begins to define everything he does. And as time passes, this focus becomes stronger, more refined, until it is no longer simply a response to loss, but the foundation of his identity itself, something that cannot be separated from who he is without unraveling everything that has been built upon it. At the same time, beyond the immediate sphere of the village, the effects of what has occurred begin to ripple outward, reaching those who observe from a distance, those who see within this moment not just a tragedy, but an opportunity, a confirmation of beliefs that have already begun to take shape. And among them, Obito Uchiha continues to move quietly through the world, guided by a perspective that has shifted far beyond what it once was. For him, the destruction of the Uchiha is not simply an isolated event, but a reflection of something much larger, a demonstration of the inherent instability of the world, the way in which systems that claim to protect can also destroy, the way in which individuals can be shaped and used in service of goals that extend beyond their understanding. And within this realization, his own path becomes clearer, more defined, as he moves toward a vision that seeks not to fix the world, but to replace it entirely. There is something deeply unsettling about the clarity that emerges from this perspective, because it is not driven by chaos, but by a kind of logic, a belief that the only way to eliminate suffering is to eliminate the conditions that allow it to exist, even if doing so requires the creation of something that exists outside the natural order altogether. And yet, even as these larger movements begin to take shape, the world does not immediately shift in response, but continues forward in a way that feels almost disconnected from what has occurred, as though the consequences are being delayed, held back by the inertia of what has already been established. And it is within this delay that another kind of darkness begins to emerge, one that is less defined by singular events and more by the gradual erosion of trust and understanding. Within the village, Naruto Uzumaki grows up largely unaware of the deeper truths that surround him. And yet, he is not untouched by the world he inhabits, because even without full knowledge, he carries within him a burden that sets him apart, a presence that others respond to with fear and distance, even if they do not fully understand why. There is a quiet parallel here, one that is easy to overlook at first, but becomes more apparent over time, as both Naruto and Sasuke move through the same environment, shaped by different forms of isolation, different kinds of loss, and yet both influenced by the same underlying system, one that creates divisions, that assigns roles, that defines individuals in ways that are difficult to escape. For Naruto, the isolation is external, a separation imposed upon him by others, while for Sasuke, it is internal, a distance created by the weight of what he carries. And as these two paths begin to develop alongside one another, there is a sense that they are moving toward something, toward a point where these different forms of isolation will intersect in a way that reveals something deeper about the world they are a part of. But before that convergence can occur, the world itself must continue to shift, must move through additional moments that further expose the instability that exists beneath its surface. And one of the most significant of these moments arrives not as a hidden event, but as something far more visible, far more direct, a demonstration of power that disrupts the fragile sense of security that has been maintained when Orochimaru returns, no longer as a hidden presence within the village, but as an external force acting against it. The illusion of control that has been carefully constructed begins to fracture in a way that cannot be ignored, because this is not a quiet manipulation or a concealed decision, but an open confrontation, one that forces the village to face the reality of what it has allowed to develop. His invasion is not simply an act of aggression, but a culmination of everything that led him to this point, a reflection of the path he has taken, shaped by his own fears, his own desires, and the system that both created and rejected him. And in this moment, all of those elements converge into something that feels both inevitable and deeply unsettling. The battle that follows is not just a physical conflict, but a symbolic one, representing the clash between what the village believes itself to be and what it actually is. And at the center of this clash stands Hiruzen Sarutobi, once again placed in a position where he must confront the consequences of the world he helped maintain. His final battle with Orochimaru is often remembered for its intensity, for the techniques used, for the scale of what is at stake. But beneath all of that, there is something quieter, something more reflective, because this is not just a battle between two individuals, but between two perspectives, two ways of understanding the world, one that seeks to preserve what exists, and one that seeks to transcend it entirely. And when Hiruzen ultimately gives his life in that confrontation, sealing away part of Orochimaru's power at the cost of his own, there is a sense of resolution on the surface, a victory that restores a degree of stability. But beneath that surface, there is another layer, one that cannot be ignored, because his death is not simply the end of a battle, but the loss of a figure who represented balance, who stood between extremes in a way that few others could. With his passing, the village loses more than a leader. It loses a form of restraint, a presence that held certain forces in check. And without that presence, the balance that once existed begins to shift in ways that are subtle at first. But that will become increasingly significant over time. And so, the world continues forward, shaped by everything that has come before, carrying within it the consequences of choices that cannot be undone, moving steadily toward moments that will reveal even more clearly just how fragile its structure truly is. As the darkness that has been building quietly beneath the surface begins to rise once again, not as something new, but as something that has always been there, waiting for the right conditions to fully emerge. There is a certain kind of breaking point that does not arrive suddenly, but rather reveals itself only after everything has already been pushed too far, when the weight of countless smaller fractures finally gathers into something that can no longer remain hidden. And by the time the world recognizes it, the collapse has already begun in ways that cannot be easily contained. In the shinobi world, that breaking point is never announced, never marked by a single clear beginning, but instead emerges quietly, as if it had always been there, waiting beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. After the loss of Hiruzen Sarutobi, the Hidden Leaf Village continues to function, its systems still in place, its people moving forward with the same routines, the same responsibilities. And yet, there is a subtle absence that cannot be replaced, a kind of quiet instability that begins to spread not through obvious failure, but through the absence of something that once held everything together. It is not that the village becomes weak, but that it becomes uncertain. And uncertainty, when left unaddressed, has a way of inviting something else to fill the space it creates. At the same time, far beyond the immediate awareness of the village Bahito, forces that have been gathering for years begin to move with greater intention, no longer content to remain in the shadows, no longer limited to isolated actions that can be dismissed or contained. And within these movements, the Akatsuki begins to take on a presence that feels less like an organization and more like an inevitability, as though it is not simply acting upon the world, but emerging from it, shaped by everything that has come before. What makes the Akatsuki so unsettling is not just the strength of its members, but the clarity of its purpose, a purpose that is rooted not in chaos, but in a deeply structured understanding of the world's failures. And within that understanding lies a belief that feels disturbingly logical, the idea that peace, as it has been pursued by the villages, has never truly worked, that it has only delayed conflict, disguised it, reshaped it into new forms without ever eliminating its source. At the center of this belief stands Pain, Nagato, a figure who does not simply lead, but embodies the ideology that drives everything forward. Someone whose understanding of suffering has stripped away any remaining attachment to the idea that the world can be changed through conventional means. For him, peace is not something that can be negotiated or nurtured, but something that must be enforced through a demonstration so overwhelming that it leaves no room for doubt, no space for the cycle to continue. There is something deeply unsettling in the calm certainty of this perspective, because it does not come from ignorance or cruelty alone, but from experience, from a lifetime shaped by war, by loss, by the repeated failure of systems that claimed to protect, but ultimately could not prevent the same patterns from repeating themselves. In that sense, his belief does not exist outside the world, but as a direct response to it, as something that has grown from its very foundation. As this ideology begins to move into action, the world is drawn into a moment that feels less like a new conflict and more like a culmination, as though everything that has been building quietly in the background is finally converging into something that can no longer remain contained. The Hidden Leaf Village, which has long represented stability, becomes the focal point of this convergence, not because it is uniquely flawed, but because it embodies the system itself, the very structure that Pain seeks to challenge. When the first signs of his arrival begin to appear, they are not immediately understood for what they are: small disruptions, fragments of something larger that has not yet fully revealed itself. And yet, there is an underlying tension that begins to form, a sense that something is approaching, something that cannot be resolved through ordinary means. And when that presence finally makes itself known, it does so with a clarity that leaves no room for uncertainty. There is no attempt to conceal, no effort to disguise what is about to happen. The confrontation is direct, deliberate, and in its openness, it carries a kind of weight that feels fundamentally different from the hidden tragedies that came before, because this is not a moment that can be rewritten or reframed, not something that can be contained within secrecy or explained away through partial truths. It is a reality that demands to be seen. The destruction begins in stages, not as a single overwhelming event, but as a gradual unraveling. as though the village itself is being carefully dismantled piece by piece, each moment contributing to a larger understanding of what is being demonstrated. Buildings that once stood as symbols of safety begin to collapse. Defenses that were believed to be sufficient are broken with ease, and the people within the village, those who once trusted in its protection, are forced to confront the fragility of that trust in the most direct way possible. There is something almost methodical in the way this destruction unfolds, not chaotic or uncontrolled, but purposeful, as though each action is part of a larger statement, a demonstration of what it means for a system to fail completely. And within that demonstration, there is no distinction between soldier and civilian, no separation between those who fight and those who simply exist within the structure. Because, from Pain's perspective, the system itself is the source of the problem, and everything within it is part of that system. For those who experience this moment, there is no time to fully process what is happening, no space to step back and understand it as part of a larger narrative, because the immediacy of it demands a different kind of response, one that is driven by survival rather than reflection. And yet, even within that urgency, there is an awareness, a growing realization that what is being faced is not just an attack, but a statement, something that carries meaning beyond the immediate destruction. At the center of this moment stands Naruto Uzumaki, returning to a village that has been transformed beyond recognition, confronted not only with the physical reality of what has been lost, but with the deeper implications of what it represents. For him, this is not simply a battle to be fought, but a confrontation with the very questions that have been building throughout the world's history. Questions about the nature of peace, about the cost of stability, about whether the system he has always believed in can truly lead to something better. His encounter with Pain is not defined solely by the clash of power, though that power is immense, but by the exchange that unfolds within it, a dialogue that carries the weight of everything that has come before, as two perspectives shaped by the same world come into direct opposition. Pain speaks from a place of certainty, from a belief that suffering is the only universal truth, the only force strong enough to unify humanity, while Naruto stands at a point of uncertainty, not because he lacks conviction, but because he refuses to accept that suffering must be the foundation upon which everything else is built. There is something quietly significant in that refusal, because it does not come from ignorance, but from an awareness of the same realities that shaped Pain. And yet, instead of drawing the same conclusion, Naruto moves in a different direction, one that does not yet have a clear form, but that resists the idea that the cycle must continue in the same way it always has. The battle itself becomes a reflection of this divide, not just in its outcome, but in its meaning, as each moment carries with it both physical consequence and philosophical weight, each exchange contributing to something that extends beyond the immediate conflict. And when the confrontation reaches its conclusion, when Pain is finally defeated, there is no simple sense of victory, no clear resolution that restores what has been lost, because the village remains in ruins, because the lives that were lost do not return simply because the conflict has ended, because the questions that were raised do not disappear with the one who asked them. Instead, what remains is something far more complex, a space filled with both loss and possibility, with uncertainty and fragile hope, with the understanding that something has shifted, not in a way that erases the past, but in a way that opens the possibility of a different future, even if that future is still undefined, still vulnerable to the same forces that have shaped everything up to this point. And as the aftermath begins to settle, as the immediate chaos gives way to a quieter reconstruction, there is a sense that the world has reached a threshold, that it stands at a point where the path forward is no longer entirely dictated by what came before. And yet, the weight of that past still lingers, still influences, still shapes the decisions that will determine what comes next. Because even in moments of change, the shadows of earlier choices remain. And the question that continues to exist, quietly and persistently, is not whether the world can be rebuilt, but whether it can be rebuilt differently, or whether, despite everything that has been lost and everything that has been learned, it will once again follow the same path, drawn back into the same cycle that has defined it for so long. There is a moment, somewhere between destruction and resolution, where the world seems to hesitate, as though it is no longer certain which direction it is meant to move in. And in the aftermath of pain, Nagato's assault, that hesitation begins to take shape across the shinobi world in a way that feels both subtle and deeply significant. Because for the first time in a long while, the consequences of everything that has come before are no longer distant or abstract, but immediate, undeniable, and shared. The Hidden Leaf Village rebuilds, but it does so differently now, not simply restoring what was lost, but carrying within it the awareness that what once felt permanent can disappear in an instant. And that awareness lingers in quiet ways, in how people speak, in how they look at one another, in the understanding that safety is not something guaranteed, but something constantly at risk of being taken away. For Naruto Uzumaki, this moment does not feel like victory, even though the threat has been stopped, even though the village still stands, because what he carries from that confrontation is not the satisfaction of having won, but the weight of the questions that were left behind. Questions about pain, about understanding, about whether the world can truly change, or whether it will always return to the same patterns it has followed for so long. And yet, within that uncertainty, there is something else beginning to emerge, something quieter, less defined, but present nonetheless. A shift in how people begin to see one another. A recognition that the boundaries between villages, between enemies and allies, are not as absolute as they once seemed, and that perhaps the world does not have to remain divided in the same way it always has. This shift does not happen all at once, nor does it erase the tensions that still exist, but it begins to open space for something that had not been fully possible before. A fragile kind of cooperation, a willingness to look beyond immediate interests and consider a larger picture, even if that picture is still unclear. At the same time, beyond what can be seen, beyond the visible efforts to rebuild and move forward, there are still forces in motion, still pieces of a larger design that have not yet been revealed. And it is in this quiet space between recovery and realization that those forces begin to align more clearly than ever before. Obito Uchiha, no longer content to remain hidden behind layers of manipulation, begins to move more openly, more directly, stepping into a role that reflects the culmination of everything he has become, everything he has lost, and everything he now believes must be done in order to bring an end to the world's suffering. There is a clarity to his actions now, a sense that the path ahead has already been decided, and that what remains is simply the execution of a plan that has been building for years, one that draws together all of the elements that have been quietly moving beneath the surface, all of the unresolved conflicts, all of the ideologies that have been shaped by the world's history. His declaration of war does not come as a sudden shock, but as something that feels almost inevitable, as though it is the natural result of everything that has led to this point. And in that inevitability, there is something deeply unsettling, because it suggests that the world has been moving toward this moment all along, even when it believed it was moving away from conflict. The Fourth Great Ninja War begins not simply as a battle between nations, but as a confrontation between different understandings of reality itself, between those who believe the world can still be changed through connection, and those who have come to believe that such change is no longer possible within the structure that exists. As the war unfolds, it becomes clear that this is not a conflict that can be resolved through strength alone, because the forces at play are not only physical, but philosophical, shaped by beliefs that cannot be defeated in the same way as an enemy on the battlefield. Techniques like Edo Tensei bring back those who were once lost, forcing the living to face not only the power of their predecessors, but the weight of their legacy, the unresolved questions that continue to exist across generations. And in these encounters, there is a sense that the past itself is refusing to remain in the past, that it is actively shaping the present in ways that cannot be ignored. Figures like Madara Uchiha emerge not simply as threats, but as representations of earlier conclusions, of perspectives that were formed long before the current moment, yet still hold relevance, still carry weight, still challenge the idea that the world has truly changed. Madara's presence, in particular, feels like a return to something foundational, a reminder that the conflict between control and freedom, between imposed peace and earned understanding, has always existed at the core of the shinobi world, and that even now it remains unresolved. As the war intensifies, as the lines between past and present blur further, the scale of what is at stake becomes increasingly clear. Because this is no longer about preserving a village or even a world as it currently exists, but about determining whether that world should continue at all. The plan for the infinite Tsukuyomi begins to take shape more concretely, revealing itself not just as an abstract idea, but as something tangible something that can be achieved, something that threatens to replace reality itself with a constructed version where suffering no longer exists. There is something almost peaceful in the description of that world, a place where no one has to endure loss, where conflict cannot arise, where everything exists in a state of perfect stillness. And yet, beneath that peace, there is a quiet emptiness, because such a world would require the removal of everything that makes existence dynamic, the ability to change, to grow, to struggle, to connect in ways that are not predetermined. For Naruto, and for those who stand with him, this realization becomes central, not as a rejection of the desire to end suffering, but as a refusal to accept a solution that removes the very essence of what it means to live. And in that refusal, there is something that feels both fragile and powerful, because it does not rely on certainty, but on the willingness to continue despite uncertainty. And yet, even as this resistance takes form, even as the war moves closer to its most critical moments, there is a sense that the outcome is not yet fully determined, that something still remains unresolved, something that extends beyond the immediate conflict, beyond the visible confrontation between opposing forces. Because beneath everything, beneath the battles and the ideologies and the plans that seek to reshape the world, there is still the question of whether the cycle itself can be broken, whether the patterns that have defined history can truly be altered, or whether they will simply continue in new forms, reshaped, but never fully escaped. And it is in this space, this quiet uncertainty that exists even in the midst of overwhelming conflict, that the story begins to slow once again. Not because it is nearing an end, but because it is approaching something deeper, something that cannot be resolved through action alone, something that requires a different kind of understanding, one that has not yet fully emerged, but that waits just beyond the edge of what can currently be seen, as the world moves closer to a moment that will not only decide its future, but redefine the meaning of everything that has come before. There is a strange kind of quiet that follows the end of something immense, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that feels filled with everything that has just occurred, as though the world itself is still holding on to the memory of it, unsure of how to release it. And when the fourth great ninja war finally begins to settle into that quiet, it does not feel like a conclusion, but like a pause within something much larger, something that has not truly ended, only changed its shape once again. The infinite. Tsukuyomi is broken. The illusion that threatened to replace reality dissolves, and the world returns to itself. But it does not return unchanged, because the knowledge of what almost happened lingers, a quiet awareness that the boundary between reality and something else is far thinner than it once seemed, and that the choices made in pursuit of peace can lead to outcomes that erase the very essence of what they were meant to protect. At the center of that unraveling stands Naruto Uzumaki, not as someone who has solved the world's problems, but as someone who has refused to accept the solutions that were offered. And there is a quiet significance in that refusal, because it does not come with certainty. It does not promise that things will be better, but it insists that they can be, even if the path forward is unclear. And yet, even as the war reaches its end, even as the larger threat is removed, there remains something unresolved, something that cannot be addressed by defeating an enemy or dismantling a plan, because it exists on a more personal level, within the bonds that have been shaped and broken throughout everything that has come before. Sasuke Uchiha stands apart from the others, not fully aligned with what has been achieved, not entirely convinced that the world can move forward in the way Naruto believes. And in that distance, there is a reflection of everything that has defined his path: the loss, the manipulation, the choices that were never truly his to begin with. All of it leading him to a conclusion that feels, in its own way, just as certain as the ones that came before. For Sasuke, the problem has never been a single individual or a single event, but the system itself, the structure of the world that allows these cycles to continue. And in that understanding, he arrives at a belief that echoes earlier ideologies, though it takes on a different form, one that does not seek to replace reality entirely, but to control it in a way that prevents its flaws from manifesting again. There is something deeply familiar in this perspective, because it mirrors the same pattern that has repeated throughout history: the idea that peace can be achieved through control, through the removal of uncertainty, through the imposition of a single will that stands above all others. And in that familiarity, there is a quiet recognition that even after everything that has been learned, the cycle still has a way of continuing. His final confrontation with Naruto is not simply a battle, but a culmination of everything that has been building between them, not just their individual paths, but the larger question of what the world should become. And within that confrontation, there is a sense that neither of them holds a complete answer, that both are shaped by the same world, yet have arrived at different conclusions about how to respond to it. The battle itself is intense, but beneath that intensity, there is something quieter, something reflective, as though each moment carries not just the force of their abilities, but the weight of everything that has led them there, every loss, every decision, every moment that shaped who they have become. And when it finally ends, when both are left at the edge of their strength, there is no clear victory, no decisive moment that resolves everything, but rather a quiet understanding that emerges between them. Not one that erases their differences, but one that acknowledges them, that accepts the complexity of the world they inhabit, rather than attempting to simplify it into something absolute. Sasuke's decision to step away from his path, to relinquish the control he sought to impose, does not come from defeat, but from a shift in perspective, a recognition that the world cannot be forced into a perfect state without losing something essential. And in that recognition, there is a subtle but important break in the pattern that has defined so much of history. But even this moment does not bring complete resolution. because the world they return to is still the same world that produced everything they experienced, still shaped by the same structures, the same histories, the same underlying tensions that cannot be erased simply because they have been acknowledged. The villages rebuild, alliances strengthen, and there is a sense of movement toward something more unified, more cooperative. And yet, beneath that movement, there is an understanding that this is not the end of conflict, not the final resolution of the cycle, but rather another point within it, another moment where the direction has shifted, but the underlying forces remain. There is something both hopeful and unsettling in that realization, because it suggests that while change is possible, it is never absolute, never permanent, always vulnerable to the same conditions that existed before. And in that vulnerability, there is a kind of responsibility, a need to remain aware, to continue questioning, to avoid falling back into the same patterns without recognizing them. For Naruto, this becomes part of what it means to move forward, not to believe that everything has been solved, but to accept that it has not, and to continue anyway, to build connections where they did not exist before, to hold on to the belief that understanding can exist even within a world that has proven time and time again how fragile that understanding can be. And as time passes, as the world begins to settle into a new kind of normal, there is a quiet sense that something has changed, not in a way that removes the darkness entirely, but in a way that acknowledges it more clearly, that allows it to be seen rather than hidden. And in that visibility, there is the possibility of responding differently, even if that response is not perfect. Because perhaps the darkest moments in this world are not only defined by what happens within them, but by how they are remembered, how they are understood, how they shape the choices that follow. And if those choices can be made with a deeper awareness of what came before, then maybe, in some small way, the cycle can be altered, not broken entirely, but shifted, redirected toward something that, while still uncertain, carries within it the potential for something better. And so the world continues, not in perfect peace, not in complete resolution, but in a quieter state, one that exists between what has been lost and what might still be built, moving forward slowly, carefully, carrying with it the memory of everything that has shaped it, and the understanding that the future is not something that will arrive fully formed, but something that must be created, moment by moment, within the fragile space between darkness and light.